All right, so we're going to get into what is labeled Chapter 20. And when we're talking about Chapter 20, what the focal point is how the Europeans or the European entities and the Native American groups in North America, Central America, South America collide. And there's a collide of cultures, and there's basically, this is the time period in which European states and countries conquered Native American tribal associations and empires. What we'll focus on mostly today is going to be Spain and their empire in the New World. We'll start off with a few key facts and figures regarding exploration. There was some advanced technology that was going on during this time. One thing you have to really note in history is that during the 1200s, sailors really had a lot of trouble in the oceans because they really couldn't battle heavy winds. So oftentimes what they would have to do when they're sailing in the open seas is stay near the coastline. And they really couldn't venture all that far out into the center portions of the ocean because they just couldn't battle those winds and they had a lot of trouble. So really one of the big ideas that you want to take from this is that they couldn't sail against the wind. That's really the problematic theme here. But by the 1400s, shipbuilders began to design what's called the caravel. The caravel was a much sturdier vessel, a little bit larger, and it utilized triangular sails that allowed for sailing against the wind. That was the design feature that helped sailors develop and become much more efficient at this time period. This is what the caravel generally looks like. You can see it's pretty normal on this part, but on this end here, you can see two triangular sails. These are really the major advancements that allow the caravel to sail against the wind. Now, I'm not a maritime expert, but you could research how the triangular sail allows ships to sail against the wind, and that would be something of great expertise. Okay, next we'll also take a look at some other advancements, including the astrolabe and the compass. The astrolabe is actually a Muslim invention that was used to calculate latitude based on the positions of stars. And then the compass, of course, is a Chinese invention, which is helping for tracking direction. Okay, one of the early Portuguese explorers. Portugal and Spain really had a lot going back and forth in their exploration. This is Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama is a Portuguese explorer. He explored the East African coast in 1497, and then he actually reached the port of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. One of the things that he was very well known for was trading for rare spices, silks, and precious gems. But this voyage basically provided knowledge of a direct route to India for Portugal. So Portugal mastering this first meant that Spain was behind. And that's where Christopher Columbus eventually comes into play, trying to find a direct route to India by way of traveling west. We're going to talk about next how this sort of rivalry continues on. And this is going to lead us to Portugal establishing ports all along western coast of Africa. We've learned about that in the past, back in chapter 15, also in chapter 18 and 19. But Spain also wanted to discover the route to Asia. And through Christopher Columbus, Spain eventually landed in the Americas and started to make claims there. This became a very competitive rivalry between the two countries for claiming new lands, both in Asia, but also in the New World. Actually, in 1493 into 1494, the Pope at the time, Pope Alexander VI, got involved in this rivalry and suggested a treaty. The treaty became known as the Treaty of Tortasias. It's basically an imaginary dividing line in the Atlantic Ocean. It's known as the line of demarcation, and it gave all of the lands west of that line to Spain, which is mostly the Americas, and all of the lands east of that line to Portugal, which is getting basically Brazil and then most of West Africa. Okay, so this map here will give us a little bit of a better understanding on the Treaty of Tortasias. Basically, if you look at this map, this is about 60 degrees west longitudinal line right here. If you take a look at this and you go right down here, this is about where the treaty or the line of demarcation was, right around in this area here. So all of this land here, Mexico, Peru, Chile, this was all given to Spain by the Treaty of Tortasias. This portion of Brazil here, and then this coast of West Africa was granted by the Pope to, of course, Portugal. And that's basically the dividing boundaries of the Treaty of Tortasias right there. Didn't really take into account any of the native peoples of Africa or South America or Central America. So they were just deciding, okay, now this land is now controlled by Spain. This land is now controlled by Portugal. All right, next we're going to take a look at some of the other challengers at this time in Asia. You have the English, you have the Dutch. They're both creating East India companies, which would direct and establish trade, large fleets for trade. They would have also warships that would accompany some of those ships to defend against piracy, things of that nature. All were going on at this time. If you watch the Pirates of the Caribbean, that's kind of this time in history right here, coming around there. Columbus. Talk a little bit about Columbus. I'm sure that you know a little bit about Christopher Columbus in the story there, but his goal was to sail west across the Atlantic Ocean in search of an alternate route to the Indies, which would be India with the spice trade, in 1492. But instead, we know on accident, he landed in the Caribbean. His first encounters are really important because the words that he uses to refer to the natives are a total misnomer, but it's stuck to this day, and it's kind of sad. Columbus set sail from Spain, of course, on August 3rd, 1492, with three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I'm sure you've heard that story. On October 12th, so only a few months, he lands in the Americas. He thought he reached the East Indies, and therefore he called the people that he encountered Los Indios, which means Indians. Scholars believe that he actually landed on an island in the Bahamas. The natives that he would have met were called the Taino, and their central region was the island of Cuba. Columbus claimed this land for Spain, and he actually called it San Salvador, which meant Holy Savior. So this terrible mistake that Columbus thought he was in India or the Indies, calling the Native Americans Indians, that has stuck to this day. Columbus goes for the gold. You have to understand that Columbus, as many other ideas that people want to throw out there, he was interested in gold. He wrote about it in his journal. It's documented. He searched and claimed other islands for Spain, all for the purpose of exploration and trying to find gold. Columbus returned back to Spain in 1495. He's actually met with great enthusiasm. In fact, the Spanish rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella, would fund 3 more voyages back to the Americas. On the subsequent voyages, though, Columbus journeyed more as an empire builder rather than an explorer. For example, his fleet would consist of 17 ships, 1,000 soldiers and crewmen, and then people specifically chosen to become colonists, to stay, to establish farms and plantations, to enslave natives. So this is why a lot of the writings and the historical discussion around Columbus and should we celebrate Columbus Day, these are some of the factors that are being put in play in our modern times that are debating, was Columbus a good guy? Was he a bad guy? So those are some of the things that are going on. What they created, though, were colonies. Colonies, by definition, are lands controlled by another nation. These lands are usually non-adjacent to the homeland territory. So for Spain, obviously, they are a European country, but colonies would be areas of control that are non-adjacent to Spain in other parts of the world. That's what a colony would generally be. We also do want to take a look at some of the other explorers at this time that were making some waves. Pedro Cabral was a Portuguese explorer who claimed Brazil in 1500. So that's how Portugal eventually was able to claim Brazil due to the Treaty of Tortasias. You also have Amerigo Vespucci. He was an Italian, but he was sailing for Portugal. The Americas are actually named after him because he charted a lot of graphs and maps known as cartography that really gave the outline of the American continents. And then you have Ferdinand Magellan. He was a Portuguese sailor. He sailed around the southern tip of South America and into the Pacific Ocean. He was eventually killed, though. He got involved in a local war in the Philippines as he stopped with his crew to try and resupply. And the rest of his crew that escaped, they were able to continue on. And they actually became the first crew to circumnavigate the globe. They sailed all the way around the world. I'll show you a map of how that kind of looked here in just one second. Okay, so if you take a look at this map, you're going to see here that the purple lines right here are representing Ferdinand Magellan. Well, there's a lot of purple lines. They're all for Spain and Portugal, but this line right here that comes down along the coast of South America through the waterways that are able to be navigated here and then into the Pacific Ocean, that's the route of Ferdinand Magellan. So over in what would be right around in this area, also maybe over in way far out here, the Philippines, that's where he dies. But his crew eventually sails along India, back up through the coast of Africa here, and then back to, of course, Portugal. And that's the first circumnavigation of the globe, happening in 1519 all the way to 1522. So it took about 3 years to do that. And of course, they're going to have to stop at certain places to resupply. Okay, next we'll take a look at now back into Spain here and the Spanish conquest in Mexico. Hernan Cortes is generally credited with being the conquistador that defeats the Aztecs. Now, conquistadors, Spanish word for conquerors. Cortes conquers the Aztecs by funding his own expedition into the Yucatan Peninsula in 1519. His crew consisted of only about 500 men, 11 total ships, 25 horse, and about 25 muskets. So really, they didn't have all that much firepower. Very small group if you look at it in comparison to the Aztec Empire, which had close to 25 million entirely, 3 million men in the army. They also had several cannon, though, and the cannon proved to be very beneficial on the battlefield and also created a fear factor. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma, of course, sent spies out to greet Cortes. Cortes was inquiring about gold. Montezuma said he would give him some as long as the Spanish agreed to leave. That's not going to happen. That was a big mistake. So as soon as Cortes learns that the Aztecs did have gold, he becomes intent on acquiring all of it. Cortes is invited by Montezuma eventually into Tenochtitlan, because what happens is that Cortes is mistaken by Montezuma for a possible returning god called Quetzalcoatl. For that information, we'd have to refer back to what you learned about in chapter 16. I may make a separate video which explains how this conquest happened, because when you talk about 500 men defeating an Aztec empire of over 20 million, that's a pretty impressive story. I think there should be a movie made about this, and I can't wait for one to come out. But this is really one of the most interesting stories in history to me personally. The Spanish sent a captain eventually named Narvaez to try and stop Cortes, because it turns out that Cortes left to do this unauthorized. Cortes left the city of Tenochtitlan to confront Narvaez. He defeated him, but he then recruits some of those men that Narvaez brought, which added a few hundred men to the story. Still nothing in comparison to the Aztec military. While he was gone, though, the Spanish actually grow quite afraid that the Aztecs are planning to kill and sacrifice them, because, they see some sacrificial religious practices taking place. And so what the Spanish do is they start to massacre unarmed Aztecs in their own religious temples. This causes the Aztecs to fight back, kill many of the Spaniards that remained in the city. And it was going to be this event, which is called the Noche Triste, or the Sad Night, in Aztec/Mexican history. Also Spanish history kind of celebrates this as well. But when Cortes returns, he comes into this situation, and this is when the fighting actually breaks loose between the Spanish and, of course, the Aztec. Now, there are, in my opinion, when I was a college student, I wrote an essay about the key factors that led to the Spanish victory in 1521. I'm going to share those with you briefly here. So these are my own personal thoughts here. But also, I think I'm going to make a separate video just focusing in on how this conquest really went down. So the first major factor that led to the Spanish becoming victorious in this was the Quetzalcoatl theory. See, this is an ancient Toltec god. It's a god that the Aztecs believed in. He was exiled. This person was Tapultzin. He was believing in Quetzalcoatl, but he was exiled. He was kicked out of the Nahuatl speaking area or the area of the Aztec Empire. It was prophesied that eventually he would return one day. He was light skinned, he was bearded, he loved gold, he was trying to get the Toltec to try and stop human sacrifice. And he was also trying to get them to worship this different god, Quetzalcoatl, as their main god. So this is why the people took issue with him, because he was trying to change so much. But see, when Hernan Cortes comes back, he is bearded, he's light-skinned, he wants gold. He's, of course, wanting them to change the religious practices, right, because he's Catholic. And then he also wants them to stop human sacrifice because of the religious and the moral and the ethical factor there. So the Aztec believe that Hernan Cortes may be this prophesized god, Quetzalcoatl. And when you add in the fact that the Spanish comes on these large ships, they have advanced technology, they have guns, they have cannon, they have musket, they're able to ride on a horse. You know, the horse is something that an Aztec had never seen. The largest mammal that they would probably have been accustomed to would be a deer, jaguar, possibly a llama or alpaca if they had traveled. But, you know, there really isn't any major beasts like the horse, and the horse created a fear factor there. So if you add all of these things up, you could sort of understand why Montezuma and the Aztec may have believed that Cortes was a god, or his men were gods. And so what I say with the Quetzalcoatl theory, the reason that I put it at number one as to why the Spanish were victorious, is because it bought the Spanish time. It allowed them to get inland. It allowed them to make alliances with other groups that hated the Aztec, because the Aztec were punishing them severely through heavy tribute, taking their women, taking their children, sacrificing them to their gods. So this is one of the major factors, and I think the biggest power play if you look at why the Spanish were able to defeat the Aztec. I also would argue within point number one here that had the Aztec wanted to attack the Spanish when they just arrived on the coast, I think they could have easily defeated them. They won several major battles against the Spanish. It wasn't like the Spanish just totally annihilated the Aztec. They had a lot of help from other native tribes that allowed them to be able to eventually defeat the Aztec. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. The Spanish made an alliance with a city-state that was a rival of the Aztec, that the Aztec never really could totally subdue and conquer, and that city-state was called Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans gave at least 3,000 men into the Spanish army. Some estimates put it at closer to 30,000, okay? So we don't know exactly how many men, but it was a very significant amount that helped the Aztec the Spanish defeat the Aztec. That's one of the key points there. Number three, you want to take a look at the fact that the Spanish have steel armor and weaponry. The Aztec do not. Steel armor and weaponry make a huge difference when you're talking about the weaponry of wood and obsidian that the Aztec have versus steel Toledo blade swords that the Spanish would be brandishing. This is a major factor here. The horse, I already talked about the fact that, you know, the natives have never seen a beast this large. The horse is very scary for them. They are fearful of it. It also gives a tactical advantage. You can move throughout the battlefield faster. The soldier is seated, so he's striking downward at the opponent. So the horse, even though there were only 25 of them, it made a very big factor on the battlefield. There is a key female involved in this. Her name is La Malinche. Her name is also Doña Marina. She was, okay, a former Aztec who was then sold into slavery to a Mayan tribal association. So she spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, which is Aztec. Eventually what happens is Cortes comes into contact with her. He is given her from a native tribe. This is very common. What these native chiefs or chieftains would do is they would give as a gift females to other tribal leaders, especially to the Spanish, to try and create a alliance, military alliance, political alliance. So this is very common. But the fact that she could translate from Mayan to Aztec, and then once somebody learns how to translate from Aztec to Spanish, now you can communicate here. You can communicate between the different groups, because without La Malinche, okay, Cortes would not have been able to communicate with Montezuma. He would not have been able to understand what the Aztec translators, what the Aztec diplomats were trying to say to him. He wouldn't understand the messages. He needs to decode those messages so that he can figure out where Montezuma may be vulnerable, how he can exploit Montezuma, and use his cunning and very witty tactics to do that. Number 6, we'll talk about battle tactics. Basically here, you have to understand that the Aztec goal was to capture their opponent. Their goal in battle was actually not to definitely kill the opponent. Actually, they had flower wars, which are wars just designed to take captives. So a lot of the weapons that they used were blunt, and they would try to knock out their opponent, rope them, put them in nets, and then take them back for human sacrificial purposes. So when they try to do this to the Spanish, who have steel weapon and armor, this doesn't work out so well. Think about a baseball bat conking somebody in the head with a helmet on. Yeah, it might hurt for a little bit, but it's not as effective. And meanwhile, the Spanish are using their weapons to try and kill the opponent. So you've got capture versus kill. Kill wins out here. Finally, though, we could sit here and talk about all these factors. The overarching factor that eventually led to the Spanish victory was disease. Disease in the form of smallpox was the major killer of Native American peoples. Smallpox is known to have killed about 95% of all Native American people during this time. So you can look at all of the different factors, but in my thesis, I'm arguing for them all, but I'm saying that disease is really the biggest factor, because what you have to understand is that Cortes comes over in 1517, 1519. It's not until 1521 that the Aztec are actually officially conquered. So over the course of those years, Native Americans who haven't developed immunities to these diseases, because all of these diseases come from domesticable species. If you look at Europe and Asia, they have a lot of domesticable species, Africa as well. But in the Americas, there really are no pig, goat, cow. There's an absence of domesticable species. And so a lot of these diseases that European peoples had overcome, that's because of the fact that they were closer to domesticable species, and they had overcome these because they had the bubonic plague. They had already experienced smallpox. Native peoples, this is all brand new, and so they're dying at a very high rate to this. And so their army, the Aztec army, is depleted by the time of the final battles of Tenochtitlan. Next, we're going to take a look at the Spanish conquest in Peru. The Spanish conquered the Inca also. This time they're led by Francisco Pizarro, who was another Spanish conquistador. He conquered the Inca Empire about 10 years after Cortes was responsible for conquering the Aztecs. This happens in 1532. He had an even smaller force of only 200 men. The Inca ruler at the time was Atahualpa. And what happens, to make a long story short, is they have a meeting at a city of Cajamarca. You've got Pizarro entering Peru. You have Atahualpa coming with his army, and they're having a meeting. Pizarro actually summoned Atahualpa to the meeting near the city of Cajamarca. Pizarro and his small force ambushed about 3,000 unarmed Inca soldiers, and they kidnapped Atahualpa. The Inca were unsure how to react to this kidnapping. They were demoralized. They couldn't function without their leader. Atahualpa offered the Spanish enormous amounts of gold and silver in return for his release. The Spanish, they got this. They got, I think, over 20 tons of gold and silver. It's the largest ransom ever paid in world history, by all accounts and documentation. The Spanish took the ransom, but they actually eventually executed Atahualpa anyway. Pizarro then went on to capture the capital city of Cusco in 1533. And that, making a long story short, is how the Inca were conquered by the Spanish. Now, I do want to show you something here in just one second that kind of helps reinforce what I'm saying, that I'm not just making this up. So in your textbook, it talks about Atahualpa. We believe he was born around the 1500, and he lived only into his 30s. In 1533, he was killed. I want to read this to you. Atahualpa was the last ruler of the Incan Empire in Peru. After Atahualpa was captured and held ransom by the Spanish, the Incan people throughout the empire brought gold and silver. that the Spanish had melted down into bullion and ingots. They accumulated 24 tons of gold and silver, the richest ransom in history. The Spanish executed Atahualpa despite the ransom paid by his people, as he was about to be burned at the stake, very common Catholic execution style. He was offered by the Spanish to convert to Christianity, which would bring him let's say, a more merciful death by strangulation. He agrees to convert to Christianity, but then he is still killed. And this is how the last and final emperor of the Inca died. That's pretty awful. Okay, next we'll take a look at Spain's pattern of conquest. Most of the Spaniards in the Americas were men known as peninsulares. Basically, these are Spaniards in the Americas, but they were born in Spain. Spain is the Iberian Peninsula, and so the people there are called, if they're full-blooded Spaniards born in Spain, they're called peninsulares. What was happening, though, is relationships between Spanish men and native women became very common. And the offspring of that relationship is called a mestizo. A mestizo is a mixed culture of Spanish and Native American. Also, a system called the Encomienda system was developed. This was a forced work system that the Spanish would use to oppress the natives. It's very similar to slavery. Under this system, natives were forced to farm and mine for their Spanish landlords. The Portuguese also did some of this in Brazil. The Portuguese would clear out forest land and build sugar plantations. Sugar was a very hot commodity in Europe at this time for tea and other sweeteners. And then Roman numeral 5 talks about how, because of their conquest in the New World, the influence of Spain expanded greatly. Talk about Golden Age Spain. All of this wealth that the Spaniards were sending back to Spain from the American colonies made it very powerful. They were the most powerful country in the world, many will argue, in the 1500s. During the Golden Age, they also built an extremely powerful navy, which was called the Spanish Armada. Next, we'll talk about, during this time, conquistadors pushed north, which would put them into the modern-day United States. In 1513, Ponce de Leon landed in Florida and claimed those lands for Spain. By 1540, the Spanish built an empire that stretched from Mexico all the way to Peru. Around 1541, Francisco de Coronado led an expedition into the present-day Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas region. And then New Mexico was formed. Spanish priests accompanied the conquistadors in search of converts. They set up missionary headquarters among the native Pueblo tribal peoples and started to try and convert them to Christianity. Sometimes that went well, sometimes it did not. There was a lot of opposition to the Spanish rule there. Spanish priests oftentimes argued against the Spanish. They did not agree with the way that the Spanish treated the Native Americans. One was named Bartolomeu de las Casas. He was a Spanish Dominican monk that worked extensively with native groups and disagreed with the Spaniards' treatment of them. You also had a leader named Pope. In 1680, a Pueblo chief named Pope led a well-organized rebellion against the Spanish. 8,000 native fighters united to drive the Spanish back toward Mexico. The natives actually ruled their homeland independently for the next 12 years. Eventually, though, as we know in our nation's history here in the United States, those native peoples would eventually be killed off or overrun. All right.